be said that prior to the pandemic, many people rarely visited shops close by because they were simply too busy. They didn't know their neighbors, or they didn't know what parks were nearby, or any other facilities that could just be within a stone's throw of your front door. So perhaps one of the few key benefits of the pandemic is that it's given us the opportunity to rediscover our locality, which ultimately has the potential to help improve the quality of our lives by helping us to restore the value of community. Enter the 15-minute city concept, a relatively new mode of urban planning that seemingly fits this idea of localization, where everything a resident could possibly need can be reached within 15 minutes by foot or by bike, so you can live, work, play, and learn without the need for significant travel to get you from your home to your place of work, to restaurants, parks, entertainment, health facilities, and so on. Sounds great so far. Paris has been leading the way of this concept since 2014 by pedestrianizing the keys of the sign and creating mini green spaces across the city, with more than 50 kilometers of bike routes added since the pandemic struck. The Mayor of Paris has furthermore pledged 1 billion euros per year for the maintenance and beautification of streets, squares, and gardens. Other cities have gone on to follow suit, enticed by a model that offers the potential for a resilient, vibrant community, and cities such as Madrid, Milan, Ottawa, Seattle have all declared that they will follow Paris's lead, and now they are coming to the UK, with over 100 councils across the country signing up to become 15-minute cities, where residents will have every facility they need within a 15-minute walk, cycle, or public transport route. Sounds ideal, right? Unfortunately, utopianism is rarely coupled with pragmatism, and this seems to be the case with this particular concept. Part of the appeal of 15-minute cities is easy to understand. Access to everyday amenities within a short trip with clean air and open green spaces is something that most people would surely want. It's a lovely idea, but when you peel back the utopian ideal, you'll very quickly see that the 15-minute cities offer a very different reality. It's not all about investing in your locality to make it a better place to live at all. Far from it. Behind all of the promise of rich green spaces and localized amenities is a dystopian plan designed to reduce your ability to travel, where access to certain parts of the city will be blocked off to vehicles, with cars being restricted to certain areas, all overseen by number plate recognition cameras installed everywhere, with automatic fines and a surveillance culture that would make Orwell turn in his grave. The utopian ideal of low traffic green urban spaces evidently comes with a price. Not only will your access be denied, but you'll also pay a hefty fine for violating the rules. This is where there is a stark difference between localism and feudalism. Localism offers a brighter vision for a better tomorrow, whereas feudalism refers to a time where people rarely left their own villages and were taxed if they dared to do so. This, it seems, is what's on offer with 15-minute cities, or low traffic neighbourhoods as they're often called in the UK. Sure, we need to reduce pollution and improve the quality of our air and water, but this isn't what this is all about. Instead, 15-minute cities are being used as a cover to restrict our movements, and who knows how far this will go. A writer with The Telegraph recently wrote that the pandemic has recalibrated people's views on the interventions that are acceptable to defend public health. And it's very clear that this particular sentiment is being seized upon by the authorities. 15-minute cities are an extension of the type of interventionism that we saw at scale during the pandemic, and will likely come with further unintended consequences that we're already beginning to witness today. Similarly, there's an incredible paternalism to the concept of 15-minute cities, the idea that the state knows best and therefore can organize people's lives on such a minute level for your own good. Unfortunately, this mentality is accelerating fast in the post-COVID world. Now, every day it seems that we learn about new forms of restrictions that will be introduced by the state for our own safety or for our own good. The speed limit on motorways could be reduced to 64 miles per hour. Restrictions could be imposed from moving from one part of the city to another. Short-haul flights might be banned. the swaths of cameras that are appearing around every major town to levy charges on anyone moving in and out of the city? How long will it be before your carbon quota determines where you can travel, what you can do, and what you can eat? You could argue that many of these concepts are born out of some reasonable intent to make the world a better place. Others might dispute this, but whatever you believe about the intent of the measures, it's always the means that are highly questionable. And it seems it's always our liberties, our rights that are under question, as we've seen time and time again over the past few years, if not decades. The low traffic scheme, or the low traffic neighbourhood scheme, as they're called in the UK, was quietly introduced during 2020, backed by a 225 million emergency government fund, which was allocated to local councils to nudge people into using buses, bikes, or walking, rather than taking private cars for short trips. A variety of means have been set out within the scheme, from physical barriers, roadblocks, number plate recognition cameras that fine people from passing a checkpoint if they're not exempt, all with the goal of trying to deter people from driving through central areas and from using their vehicles. This is hardly the bright vision of everything you need on your doorstep. Far from it. To some, this might all sound like some distant dystopian reality, but it's already here. Low traffic neighbourhoods are being rolled out at speed all over the UK. Bristol already has number plate recognition systems in place, and it certainly worked on us. We didn't drive into the city centre anymore, but we did drive out into the countryside and other parts of the city that weren't covered by the scheme and these invasive cameras, ultimately spending more time in the car and covering more miles using more fuel, which is the absolute irony of the scheme, which seeks to reduce pollution. All it did for us was made us travel for longer, spend more time in the car, and travel further, which ultimately will have a negative impact on the environment, just in a more dispersed fashion. A North London borough has recently unveiled plans to impose traffic restrictions on up to 75% of its roads to reduce pollution as part of the scheme, again designed to protect residential roads from noise and pollution. However, it's Oxford that has found itself at the centre of the debate, as it plans to ban cars from driving without a permit on 6 major roads in the city at peak times. That's right, you require permission of the state to travel within your own city, and your travel will be limited by a combination of physical barriers, traffic filters, and guess what? More traffic cameras, all designed to deter you from driving through central areas. Now, the new proposals have divided the city into zones, with strict rules limiting the number of times drivers can leave their own neighborhoods in their cars. That's right, permission-based travel from your government. When fully implemented, petrol and diesel vehicles may be required to pay between £2 and £10 to enter a roughly 1.5 square mile area in the city centre, and rising to £4 to £20 after 2025. Number plate recognition cameras will be in full force, automatically fining people £70 for passing a filter if they are not exempt. Restrictions, exemptions for your safety, the idea of being for your protection is constantly at the forefront of the message. It's usually followed by a highly emotive plea like protecting your children's health. Yes, very clever. As a new father, I'd put my own life on the line to protect my son. But again, it comes back to that reasonable intent versus highly questionable means. And not just questionable means in execution of the 15-minute cities, but questionable means in terms of the messaging. And logic and reason, of course, about the effectiveness about these measures or the wider ramifications are rapidly dismissed. Doesn't this all sound too familiar? No one is safe until we're all safe. Now, in Oxford, the plan is to cut levels of nitrogen oxide in Oxford's narrow streets. The city also wants to cut carbon emissions to net zero by 2040, a goal that will require an 88% fall in transport emissions. So if you live in an Oxford postcode, you better get used to walking or cycling. If you're disabled, elderly, on a low income, or a parent with children, your needs do not matter. You'll walk or you'll pay the price. Unless you're lucky enough, of course, to meet the criteria for an exemption. All too familiar story. Now, the Labour-led council in Oxford followed other local authorities around the country in introducing this new low traffic neighborhood during the pandemic. And it did so hastily and with very little consultation, which has sparked fierce opposition. Now, the big question is, who gave local authorities the power, authority, and autonomy to make these decisions that significantly impact on our freedom to move, our way of life? And it's clear that the implementation of low traffic neighborhoods have been heavily incentivized by central governments. And with some local governments suffering huge budgetary deficits, it's clear that money talks. But where is this directive really coming from, and where will it ultimately go? That's the question that we must be asking ourselves. And now those who simply reduce these questions to conspiracy theories are for some reason unable to see the connection with the key ideas that are being put forward by centrally imposed agendas such as the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, Agenda 2030, or the World Economic Forum's own Great Reset. You know, these ideas are central components of these particular agendas, which always seem to result in a removal of our freedoms and rights, let alone the will of the civilian or the democratic process. The greater good, it seems, is ever determined by distant, centralized, and corporate groups and distributed via state policymakers, taking precedence over any local democracy. Despite overwhelming public opposition to schemes like the low traffic neighborhoods, this is a cause set in motion. There are hundreds of local authorities signing up to 15-minute cities in the UK, and international coalitions are being formed like the C40 and the Global Covenant of Mayors, which really do show the global nature of this agenda, with many of the usual suspects involved from the World Economic Forum, George Soros, and many more. Now, the good news is that some of this opposition is starting to make a difference. Southend have already said no, Cornwall has said no, and this week Boris Johnson went on record to oppose the expansion of the ULEZ scheme in central London. Critics claim that low traffic neighborhoods merely push traffic out into other areas and make getting around far too difficult. That was certainly my own experience. But it doesn't stop there. Furious residents in Haringey in North London have slammed a controversial council scheme that has clogged up their streets, turning a 10-minute drive into an hour trip. A 15-minute journey now takes 45 minutes. How is that helping pollution? Asked a local. Someone's daughter takes now 2 hours to get home from school because the buses can't move. Chug, chug, diesel bus stuck in traffic for 2 hours sounds like a real improvement. I invite you to join me in Common Sense Corner. More time in the car, engine on for potentially longer, traveling further distances. Surely it's a simple equation. Surely this results in more pollution distributed over a wider area. The net amount of pollution will surely increase. Now, the measures were designed to minimize the amount of traffic driving through residential streets, but instead have left locals fuming that their roads are now clogged up, whilst it acts as a cash cow for the local councils. That's right. Haring residents were also angry at leaked emails that showed the council proposed using income from the low traffic neighborhoods and other penalties to plug a budget deficit, with projected fines making up 88% of the deficit. The Haringey Council could earn an eye-watering 6.1 million in fines alone in just the first 4 months of the scheme. With tens of thousands of fines already issued, £2 million has already been collected. But where is the democratic process here? A total of 85% of respondents in Warrington stated they were not consulted about the scheme before its implementation. Residents and businesses overwhelmingly opposed the scheme, saying that the results are a stark and unambiguous rejection of the low traffic neighborhood. This isn't a small sample from a handful of residents. It's a really significant response from local families and shows the strength of the feeling on this issue. Low traffic neighborhoods are set to be made permanent in South Birmingham, despite 56% of respondents rejecting the proposal entirely. Now, legal action is beginning to be threatened. Hundreds of residents have threatened to sue council chiefs for forcing a new low traffic neighborhood upon them in the market village of Dulwich in South London. And they told Southwark Council that they're considering a judicial review over the consultation process over the low traffic neighborhood. In the legal letter signed by 600 plus residents, it's alleged that the council acted and operated unlawfully by failing to make clear what its proposal was and why it was under positive consideration, as set out in previous legal cases. The legal letter adds that the council used survey responses selectively to present a misleading picture. Now, it all sounds once again too familiar. Sadiq Khan in London, before the consultation around the expansion of the ULEZ scheme, has said if there was overwhelming opposition, then the expansion would not go ahead. But far from listening to the consultation responses, it emerged last week that the City Hall may have manipulated the results in order to make them look more favourable. Last week's revelations reveal that Khan had been determined to pursue his scheme in despite of public's rejection. A Freedom of Information request showed that the mayor's officials had excluded over 5,000 consultation responses opposing the expansion of the ULEZ scheme, claiming that they were just copy and paste jobs. Well, of course they are. It's a campaign. But those 5,000 people are still expressing their views, even if they're doing so in the exact same way as their neighbor. You can't ignore that response. And of course, we know throughout COVID, there's been multiple consultations where there's been vast amounts of negativity, vast amounts of initiatives rejected completely, and they still move ahead. It's a similar pattern. So whilst legal cases may offer some hope, a community company in Hackney lost a court battle last year following a similar judicial review. So again, it's a familiar story of the judiciary acting in cahoots with the grand narratives, protecting the government and corporate interests. Now, remember, this conversation started about a beautiful utopian vision of what local neighborhoods could look like. And I, for one, would be very happy to live in an area where everything's on my doorstep. And actually, having moved from Bristol, quite frankly, most of the things I need are within a 1 mile radius. And as a result, I walk a lot, I cycle, I run. And if I need to take public transport, I'm sure it's available to me on a local basis. But it doesn't stop me from needing to travel. Today, I traveled to the other side of the city to go to a networking event for my business. Tonight, I'm attending a talk, which I need to use my car for because it's far from within my local jurisdiction. So this isn't about investing in your local area. It's not about the council saying we're going to invest in hospitality, retail, office blocks in your area. No, it's simply about restricting your movement. But the question of whether these low traffic neighborhoods even work to reduce pollution is not even being asked. Figures released in October by the Department of Transport reveal that low traffic neighborhoods have spectacularly backfired, actually increasing the total number of vehicle miles traveled. It echoes my own personal experience. Low traffic neighborhoods force motorists to take longer routes to get around these barriers and restrictions. And for example, in post-lockdown traffic data from the low traffic neighborhoods in London boroughs, it showed that those that were in restricted zones bounced back higher than the areas which had no restrictions. And again, this plays out in the COVID story. The overall net result where there's been minimal intervention is typically more favorable than where there is excess intervention. But it doesn't seem that we learn this lesson. Human beings, for some reason, under the current culture, feel like they need to intervene. Now, low traffic neighborhoods restrict vehicle access on residential roads that are often used as shortcuts in an attempt to reduce traffic and air pollution. But Rod Dennis from the RAC said that more research should be done on the impact and benefits of the low traffic neighborhoods. He said that if low traffic neighborhoods are successful in reducing overall motor traffic and encouraging more active travel like cycling and walking, then they can be seen as a positive intervention. But on the other hand, if they are simply causing more traffic and associated air pollution dispersed into other streets that aren't covered by low traffic neighborhood schemes, then there are little of no benefit. Therefore, it's very worrying, in his words, that traffic studies have not been carried out. And as such, there is no definitive proof that existing schemes have not just shifted the problems elsewhere. And of course, the same bad actors that are pumping out data are involved in the data modeling. It's the same old characters. It's the London School of Economics, it's Imperial, it's King's College, Oxford and more. The same modeling outlets that was failed spectacularly during COVID. The similarities are unparalleled. Can we trust the science? I think not. Oh, and by the way, in London, 75% of the pollution particulates actually come from outside of the city, from industry and so on. But you can't argue on logic with someone who's emotionally or ideologically invested in a narrative. If you haven't already learned that during COVID, then this is why your facts continually fall on deaf ears, because people are entwined in these narratives, these ideas, these agendas. And here's another question. Why is it always the citizens? Why is it always you and I that have to pay the price? The way to solve illegal drug consumption, for example, is not to prosecute the user, but it's to go after the manufacturers and the distributors. So why exactly is the burden of the pollution not being placed on industry, car manufacturers? Why is it that we have to upgrade our cars or restrict our movements? It's just one of these classic things where the rich get richer and the poor suffer. You know, I'm not saying that you and I are poor, but, you know, by all comparative purposes, you know, this is a first world problem I'm talking about at present. But the reality is it affects the way we live. And as always, there is unintended consequences. Again, as we witnessed throughout the entire COVID chapter, the myopic focus on COVID cases ignored any other variable. And as such, the collateral damage has been vast across almost every area of our society and economy. And it's evident that once again, this short-sightedness is playing out. These measures will have a disproportionate adverse impact on marginal and vulnerable groups, with a particular impact on the poor who may not be able to afford to upgrade their car or fork out on buses or public transport. Parents of young children struggling to get their children into buggies, onto the buses, the disabled, the elderly. They're all going to inevitably find it more challenging to walk or cycle everywhere, and may have lower budgets to actually pay for these fines or these public transport, let alone the availability of it in a nearby, if the buses also have to go around the entire city to get to their destination. But what if you can't cycle all your food shopping home for the week, or lug it back because you're too knackered because you've been working so hard, or you're being burdened by the toddlers? The economic impact on individuals and businesses is also abundantly clear. It would cost drivers hundreds of pounds a year just to use city roads. It would penalize everyone from tradespersons to parents doing the school run, and it would make outer suburbs with their poor public transport links even less accessible. Local businesses will be deprived of customer footfall, forcing people to shut shop because of plummeting revenues. The evidence is already playing out. If you look at Oxford, since the Oxfordshire County Council decided to break Oxford down into 6 residential zones, 95% of East Oxford businesses have reported that turnover has decreased by anything from 15 to 50%. They're also experiencing major issues with deliveries. Vans are having to travel further, the irony, to get to them, and they're getting stuck in traffic on more peripheral routes. And then there's the real possibility of social issues. There's a risk of deprivation and marginalization in zones that suffer a lack of investment. There's a real possibility of turf wars. One area is better equipped than its neighbor. We risk further alienating communities and taking a step backwards from the progress that's been made in building more diverse cities, rather than creating fragmented societies. The reality is that cities allow people to mix, to be together, and to share ideas. There are reasons why city centers become centers of commerce and centers of ideas. Can we recreate the creation and innovation of the city if city centers are replaced by these fragmented zones? We just don't know. It's an experiment. Those wanting to restrict movement seem to forget that the economy, science, culture, and health all depend on people and goods getting from one place to another. There are very few forms of economic activity that don't rely on movement of these things. Science would make fewer breakthroughs without experts meeting at conferences. Music would be unimaginably duller if the cross-pollination of sounds and melodies and beats between continents weren't able to be possible. Our language would be poorer. It's surely not a coincidence that we began to emerge from the Dark Ages into the Renaissance and then into modernity, when travelers started to link up between Asia, Europe, and America, carrying plants, technologies, and most of all, ideas. We risk shutting down that infinite creative channel of progress by limiting our movement. It really is like we're moving into neo-feudalistic times. Now, it may sound cold, but cities are ultimately labor markets and centers of commerce. Their primary function is to connect people with with skills, with particular demands and employers for labor. You need a wide variety of workers and companies for this division of labor to be successful. If that matching of capital and labor could happen on the scale of a neighborhood, there'd be no need for cities at all. While variety is nice, grocery stores are relatively interchangeable, and unless someone has very particular tastes or needs, they'll be willing to settle for shopping at the closest opportunity. But more specialized retail outlets, more specialized needs, more variety require different service providers that serve a smaller percentage of the population. And as a result, they'll need customers coming from outside the 15-minute zone to stay viable, which is why we travel to get certain goods. It'd be impractical for furniture manufacturers to be within 15 minutes of every single zone within the city. There are specialized goods that we deliberately travel for. All of this has been ignored. What about office blocks? Are you going to suddenly require new half-empty office blocks in your neighborhood because it's no longer acceptable or viable to travel into the city? Now, there's nothing objectionable about mixed-use neighborhoods or offices, shops, and homes, but the idea that the existence of these neighborhoods will eliminate or even substantially reduce commuting is just flawed. It's a half-baked utopian idea that's not grounded in rationality. But hey, we live in a post-truth world now where up is down, left is right, and I can identify as an inanimate object if I want to, and no one will bat an eyelid. But as we've discussed, I believe we are all yearning for a greater sense of community. We are looking for localism. We are looking for that interpersonal connection. And we'd love to have great amenities nearby, clean air, great schools, and so on. But this is not what's on offer. We're not being offered an investment in our communities. We're being offered a dystopian view of reality where our movement is limited. To conclude, the 15-minute city, as this design paradigm has been dubbed, is not an investment into a beautiful future, but rather an assault on how we go about living our daily lives. And allowing the state to control your movements and surveil your every move is a slippery slope that will only be further enabled by artificial intelligence, machine vision, and a whole host of other technologies that are becoming all too commonplace in our daily lives. We must restore democracy, we must restore reason, and we must demand better. I'm all for investing in our cities and localities so that we don't actually need to travel, but schemes that threaten to take our ability and choice to freely move should be downright rejected to avoid a dystopian reality of the surveillance state that is rapidly emerging. This is why I invite you to join us this weekend in Oxford from 1 p.m. on Broad Street, where we're going to be taking a stand. As I've mentioned in this episode, Oxford have really run with this concept. This is why it's critical that we take a stand now whilst it's in its early stages of development. Now, for more details, you can look out on my social media. I'll also put the details in the description of this episode. And you can also visit weareelevate.org to RSVP to connect with other members of our community this weekend. I want to thank you for tuning in to this important episode. Please hit the share button to share this important message so we can spread the word and help people to understand exactly what is going on in their neighborhoods. Thanks for tuning in. My name's Dan Astin-Gregory. This is the Elevate Podcast.